So hopefully you can hear me, and thank you. Thank you to the speakers who went before me, especially Eben. That was super great to hear your thoughts. I'm here to talk about 30 years of digital signage and what have we learned or learnt. So I'm going to begin with a little video. And the question is, what did you just see? So this actually was made, there was a product for the Magnavox Odyssey 2, which was, in Europe was the Philips VideoPack home gaming system. It was called Newscaster in Europe. It was called Keyboard Creations in North America. And it really was an early digital signage product. So this is what digital signage looks like in 1978 with accessible hardware and software. Thanks to the wonders of emulation, and that's also obviously the emulation community and the Raspberry Pi community have a significant overlap as well. I was able to run that software in an emulator and therefore not have to have figured out 40 years ago that I would be talking here today. So that's one example of the early days of signage. Now if we go and say, well, what does a modern pitch look like? You can see that here's an example of a modern marketing pitch for digital signage, which is to help you create attractive moving displays to enable the user to generate eye-catching displays, making full use of movement and other special effects. We want to enable non-programmers to use it. After all, the user may be a shopkeeper or a restaurateur. So this is from 1982 for the Sinclair ZX81. And actually, I thought for sure I would be the only person today to show a audio cassette on their deck, but I'm the second person today to do so. So in terms of the prehistory of signage, really there are origins that are quite a bit older than I realized, and I happen to have made a connection with the gentleman by the name of Marvin Drogsma, who actually is a fan and historian of ancient digital signage. So he was able to help me out with some of that stuff, so thanks to him. So on to Scala. So I worked at Commodore for about 5 years from 1989 to 1993, and then I moved over to Scala. But Scala's history started in 1987 in Oslo, Norway, and a gentleman by the name of Jon Böhmer, who some of you who have been here a while may actually know. When he was about 20, he started a company, and he had the idea of using the sort of unique ability of the Amiga, which was to produce nice motion graphics in a TV-compatible way and find a useful application for it. And so his spirit was very much not, hey, let's shove technology at problems, but really looking at problems. So quite a mature point of view for someone who was so young, and that's his official headshot from the early days that I scanned from some old printed material. There's an earlier photograph, which is him with Stig Pedersheim, who was the first software developer. That's in his bedroom in Norway. So that's kind of the equivalent of our Apple garage. And another interesting early tale, and I won't get too nostalgic because this is really not so much about the company, but when the company was founded, it was done from a very small amount of seed money, but at a certain point, he needed more money, and his father put up the family chicken farm as collateral, and that is really kind of our humble origin as well, that we came from such an unusual and humble place. And so if we look at one early example, so this is a hotel information channel from 1991, I believe, in the SAS Scandinavian Hotel in Oslo, and a number of different screens. So the hotel obviously wanted to be able to communicate with their customers. They have something like 500 rooms. The hardware infrastructure largely being in place with the TVs already being bought or leased. The early people in the company, including Yun, saw the opportunity to apply this technology and apply these concepts into markets like hotel TV, and they also sold the cable TV channels. And I remember one of my early trips to Norway being jet lagged and up at 3 in the morning and channel flipping through all 13 channels that existed at the time, and about 7 of them were running Scala at 3 in the morning in one form or another, whether it was the local TV channel was using it for weather or other information, or the hotel itself. And so really I think the lesson from this is that you can take something new and actually make business out of it if you can deliver it in a way that really resonates with the need and is easy to use. So in those days we had a pretty precise view. This was before I was working there, we had a pretty precise view of what we were trying to solve, and that made it possible to solve it by listening to that customer and by targeting what we were doing for what they actually needed. Let's have a quick tour through some other early applications. So this is 1992. This is convenience store TV in an Esso station in Norway, and we had probably a few dozen locations for that network. Classic CRT tubes before the LCD, which obviously flat screens was a big transformation in our industry because of the ease of placement compared to having to hang a monstrosity like that. Another example was quite interesting was the Adam and Eva shopping mall. So this was a fashion shopping center in Stockholm, Sweden, and they were using motion video and other animated graphics to kind of promote the brand, and some of the merchants had advertising on it as well. And then I wasn't able to find color pictures from this one, but I have some black and white scans. I believe the screens were color, you never know. Which was early television at McDonald's. And that was actually a project in the UK. I know Chiswick was one of the locations that was used. There were about 10 or 15 locations of that, and it was just basically rolling advertising. So very early quick service restaurant stuff. So as much as the industry was not a real industry in terms of conferences and established identities, and the term digital signage probably hadn't been tossed around yet, already we started to see, on the one hand, being pulled into a lot of different applications, on the other hand, sort of the emergence of a lot of key markets that are still strong markets today. This is another interesting and early example, so also 1992. So this was a kiosk that we did for Renault that was in both Belgium and France, so it was a multilingual project. There were about 20 dealers that had it hooked up. You could browse the cars that were available. It doesn't quite look like a modern Hyundai dealership that we saw earlier this morning, but this was early days of touchscreen interactivity, early days of car configurators. And what we learned from this project was that one of the main users of this was actually salespeople coming up to speed on all the ins and outs of the product. And so I think the lesson there is sometimes the important users aren't necessarily the users that you anticipate. And in 2015, so that's 23 years later, we did a project for Ford. So Ford launched their new F-150 pickup truck, and the major technical innovation in that truck was they replaced almost all the steel with aluminum, made the truck much lighter, and that was good for fuel economy, and it was a huge project. They had to retrain all their dealers, provide them new equipment, rekit all the factories. And what they were facing was customer education. We don't want to lose the reputation of Ford as a solid, tough truck because we've gone with a metal that doesn't have the image of steel, man of steel and steel being strong, but the aluminum trucks are still incredibly strong. So they commissioned a digital signage kiosk with a bunch of additional features where you could actually see and touch the metal to tell the story, to explain the technical innovations that went into it, and as well to be a car configurator. But it being 2.5 decades later, we actually have analytics on it, and guess what we saw? Same thing, which is in the 15 minutes prior to the dealership opening, there's a spike in usage because the sales teams have a busy life and they're busy with customers, but they want to be able to know the product as well as their customers or better, and so they spend the time in the kiosk learning the ins and outs of the product. 1992 again, so Maastricht University Hospital opened. This was a huge deal. The Queen of the Netherlands actually did the ribbon cutting for this. And there was not only was there in-room and hallway TV, but there was an interactive kiosk that had information and wayfinding. And the hospital said, when they did their surveys, 80% of the patients and visitors got some information from the interactive kiosks or from the signage. And what's interesting about this is if you look at the screenshot in the upper right, you'll see that there's a silhouette of a hand. And that's because 1992, people weren't used to interacting with touchscreen kiosks, and so there's a certain amount of education that is needed to bring people from their expectation to the new expectation. And that speaks as well to how far can you carry someone from the unfamiliar to the familiar. So this is a small step at which you can do. And actually, I think it was Tom Nix that told me the story that I guess it was his son when he was about 4 years old, went up to the TV in the family room and tried to pinch zoom the TV and said, "Dad, the